Hello everybody, and welcome to lecture number 11. I've just called this one some final writing issues and citation issues. We've mentioned some of these things before in passing, but as you get to writing your your rough draft and then your final paper, I just wanted to briefly review some issues and just kind of come at your writing your paper from a little bit different angle. As you recall from the last lecture when we were talking about your title page and abstract, we talked about how the third page, what we call the body pages of APA style, have the left justified up in the corner. You have your running head all in caps. Right justified up in the right hand corner. You have your page numbers, and unlike the title page, just a reminder, we don't have the words running head. You may recall that we gave this example. The basics of APA style here. We begin our third page. Actually, that should say basics of APA style, and that should not be 2. Sorry, I've made a mistake, and I'm not going to stop. That should be 3 because the first page would be the title page. The second page would be the abstract, and so that should say 3. I apologize. So if the title is the Basics of APA Style Introductory Workshop, and then I just dive right into my introduction. So here on the bottom, this should say on the third page only, so I apologize. Now, as we think about the process of writing your paper, I wanted to talk about mixing up your citation of your journal articles. We have a variety of ways to cite, and one of the things we want to do is, in order to make our paper readable, we want to mix it up a little bit. Instead of redundantly using the same word, boring your reader, we want to show some versatility in our writing skills, mix it all up a little bit, and use different ways of making our citations. And I've just listed 3. One way of citing your articles is what we call idea focused. In other words, that in your citation you're going to talk about an idea. Researchers have studied how children represent mathematical problems. In other words, the sentence is focused upon the idea itself, and you're way more concerned with the central idea in the articles than anything else. And so you, in your narrative, talk about the idea and then follow that with your citations. Ali Bali, Phillips and Fisher, 2009, and Siegler, 1976. So idea-faced, which will probably be most of your citations, are simply where you're referencing where you got the content from. A different approach, or maybe a mix-it-up approach, would be maybe to focus on the researcher. In this particular case, your sentence is going to focus upon a particular research study. So here's the example: Alibali, Phillips, and Fisher, and then again 2009 asked. And here they have a direct quote. So what you're doing in this particular case is, instead of focusing on idea, your sentence is constructed in a way in which you are particularly focusing upon one research study, or in some cases 2 research studies. And this is particularly good when you're, again, doing a literature review, your introduction, and you're trying to say these people found that, and in your narrative, whereas opposed to these people found that. Also, if you're focusing upon research studies that have a particular different methodology, you want to say these researchers use this method as opposed to these other researchers use this method. So that would be researcher focused as opposed to idea focused. And finally, sometimes in APA Lit Review papers, there's a chronology that we're trying to sketch out for people. Let's say we're writing a lit review on how autism has been understood over the last 50 years. Well, as you're writing your review, you're going to be focusing in this particular case on a timeline or a chronology. And in that particular case, you probably, or you can start your sentence by saying, in 1940, blah, 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 found or wrote that. So in our particular example here, in 2009, Alibali, Phillips, and Fisher. Now, you don't have to put 2009 in quotes after Alibali, Phillips, and Fisher because you're citing it in your narrative. In this particular way of citing, again, what's in focus here is the year. The researchers did something in this year. And again, this is particularly helpful or important when your lit review is making an emphasis that there has been a change over time, or there's been a progression of thought over time. So whether it's idea focused, researcher focused, or chronology focused, this is simply a way or ways that you can mix up your approach to in-text citations. Again, ideally to make your writing less tedious and perhaps just mix it up to keep your reader engaged. Now, in terms of one other thing that we did cover early on, but I want to elaborate a little more on that, is it's fairly common for us when we're reading a journal article and that journal article is citing another source. And we like the idea that came from that other source. This is simply what we call secondary source citation. Now, ideally, in the best of all possible worlds, if you weren't a busy NIAC student and had plenty of time, ideally what you want to do is, if you really, really like the data or the information that someone cites, go and find the original source and read it. And in that particular case, and that would be the ideal, you want to include both the secondary and primary source, not only in your reference pages, but also cite them in the text. But a lot of times, especially when you have a journal article that is a review journal article, and you're, if you will, doing a literature review of a review, you're going to not go and find the original source. And so in that particular case, there's a variety of ways of doing this. So let's say you wanted to paraphrase. So maybe in your article it goes something like this. Another researcher emphasized that creating an ethical solution requires the participation by all parties. Now let's say that Brophy is the article that you're reading, Brophy 2003. But Brophy, in their 2003 article, cited this other person named Thonis, this other researcher named Thonis. In that case, this is what your in-text citation has to look like. Thonis, as cited in Brophy 2003. Now, unless you look up and read Thonis, you don't have Thonis in your references. You simply have Brophy. And what you're telling the reader is, hey, I was reading Brophy and he cited this guy Thonis. And what's nice about this is you're giving Thonis credit for the idea, but you're accurately representing the fact that you didn't read Thonis. You read Brophy, who's citing Thonis. So Thonis as cited in Brophy. If you use a direct quotation, and again, you've heard in other lectures that in certain your reading you should limit this, but this is what it would look like. Maybe you might say, Thonis remarks, Writing Center literature is filled with reference to our marginality and status as outsider. And again, you're not reading Thonis's original study, you're reading Brophy quoting Thonis. So what you do is, as cited in Brophy 2003, page 70, you're not giving the page number in Thonis of the original quote. No, you're telling the reader, hey, this is where I got this from. Page 170 of Brophy's 2003 article or book, in which he or she was citing and directly quoting Thonis. So do all you can to get this. It may not apply to this paper, but again, as you go forward with your other psych courses and you write papers, it's important to cite secondary sources accurately. Now, I just want to end our lecture on just some broad, theoretical things to keep in mind. And I certainly understand that, when you're writing a paper, sometimes you're so concentrating on just getting the APA technical stuff done and repeating it that it's hard to step back and look at your paper in a big picture. But let me encourage you to do that. Even if you can't or choose not to for this paper, I think it's important for us to not specifically talk about APA style here, but just writing. When you're writing, you almost want to think of every paragraph or maybe little section as being a little kind of a standalone mini paper, or a mini argument, or just and by standalone I'm simply saying that if you rip that out, it would make of your paper overall, it would make sense. And so try and ask yourself as you're writing, or maybe as you're going back and rewriting the second or third time, ask yourself if your sections or your paragraphs have the following. Let's just call it claim, evidence, and discussion. So let's say your paragraph starts with a claim. In other words, this is what this paragraph is going to be. This is the main idea here. This is the claim we're making. Then, of course, what's the evidence for that claim? How are you going to back it up? And this is where you do your incitations. You might say something like autism has been perceived falsely over the last 50 years. Well, then, now what's the evidence for that? Maybe you're going to make a few citations on people, researchers that have written review articles. And then maybe your last sentence or two or three is a kind of discussion on that. In other words, what are the consequences? Why is this evidence that you've just cited about your claim, why is it important? Why are you bringing this up? Just simply citing evidence. And a paper that just cites, here's my claim, here's my evidence, here's my claim, here's my evidence. You want to give your readers a kind of, what's your view? How do you see this? How do you critique this? And that's what we mean by discussion. Simply the claim, the evidence, and then so what? That's what I'd call the discussion. So what? And clearly when you have evidence, you guys will only have to do 4 journal articles for your lit review, but as you go forward, you'll want to have more evidence. Well, if I make a claim and then I say evidence, and I have one obscure research study, okay, that's fine. I've cited my evidence, but sometimes in our presenting our evidence, we'll want to have multiple sources that we cite. And again, if I tell you that I have an opinion and this person agrees with me, okay. Well, or I got it from this person, that's good. But if I tell you, hey, these 3 prominent people we both respect agree with my point of view, well, what happens there is the weight of my argument is not just one person, even if they're prominent, but rather 2 or 3. It simply makes your evidence that much more credible when in your citations there are multiple citations for backing up a claim and as evidence. And so don't be afraid to have in-text citations. Again, maybe not in this paper because you only have 4 sources, but as you write further paper, to appeal with an idea that you're presenting or an idea that you're claiming to be true with multiple ways of evidence, including those secondary citations, because that's another way of increasing the weight. Brophy is citing this other person, and not only does Brophy agree, and that's why they cited this other person, but a secondary source can be a kind of a double weighted citation. Now, just a reminder, part of the challenge of writing these kind of papers is that you're summarizing, you're paraphrasing. This is what you're doing in a literature review paper, and when you get around to writing an experimental report, the introduction is your literature review. Your task, if you will, a large part of the task of the paper is to summarize. Tell me what the literature says about this subject. Now, when you summarize, you're not necessarily directly quoting, but you want to take the main ideas from 1 source, 2 sources, 4 sources. And again, summarization is to try and put it generally in your own words, but do it in a way where you're not changing the main point. You're summarizing, not inventing. And as you know from taking this entire course, we still need to attribute what we've summarized to the original sources, and so we do our in-text citations. But clearly, when you're doing a literature review paper, your paper is going to be way shorter than the 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 articles you're citing. So when we talk about summarizing, you're significantly shortening the long arguments that your lit review paper makes, and you're reshuffling them and reorganizing them and combining them and comparing them and contrasting them. So it's going to be shorter, and very often summaries, because they're summaries, they have to take a broader view as opposed to a more specific particular view. So just try to remember that with summarizing. Now, there are other times, a summary is which, I got to put this, a summary is in which pretty much you're using your own words to summarize other people's conclusions or ideas. And with regard to this, the value of summarizing is that it shortens things down, it's more efficient. Why am I going to read a review article if it's as long as the 20 articles that it reviewed? So by definition, a lit review is a shorter version of, so if you took all of your sources and they were 50 pages, well, you want to tell me, for efficiency's sake, in 5 pages, in 8 pages, what the 50 pages said. And by definition, you have to do this somewhat broadly. So here's an example. Studies show that throughout colleges and universities, teachers are often hired from one area of study to teach in different areas. Now, this is an idea. Studies, plural, Carpini 2004 and Wilson 2008. Now, there are other times when we're not just summarizing main ideas, often from multiple sources, but we're really paraphrasing. We're not quoting directly, and we're not broadly summarizing, so it's somewhere in between. Paraphrasing is somewhere in between a direct quote and a kind of 3 steps back large summary. We are taking a passage of source material, we're putting it in our own words, but very often in a way that is pretty close to the form, the progression, the ideas of our original source. Again, like this, we certainly have to make legit attributions in terms of in-text citations, but paraphrases should almost always be shorter than the quote that we're paraphrasing, or the section that we're paraphrasing. And in this particular case, a paraphrase also summarizes by being a little more focused upon the big ideas and letting some of the details go. So think of a paraphrase as a condensation in which you're following the logical flow of what you're paraphrasing, but doing it in a more efficient manner. So Lordy's 1975 research revealed that classroom experiences as well as interactions among peers and colleagues contribute to teacher learning. Now, this may have been a lot longer. It may have been maybe even a paragraph or 2 in Lordy's original research study. But by paraphrasing or summarizing, pretty much this is what Lordy's saying, but I'm condensing it down into 1 sentence as opposed to 1 or 2 paragraphs. That's what paraphrasing does. Now, clearly there are times, as you know, we want to use quotes very, very sparingly. You've already heard me say that. Quotations are legitimate. Remember, if you quote, you need to quote absolutely directly, word for word, don't change anything, attributed to the original author. And remember, with quotes, you always have to cite the page number. Never give a quote in an APA paper in which there's not a page number there. And again, you've already heard me say, but let me reiterate as you get ready or to start to write your rough draft. Use quotes when the actual quotation, the words, are so important or integral that you really don't want to misquote them. You want to just capture exactly what the author is saying. Or the author has stated something so particularly precise, pithy, accurate, that there's no way to paraphrase it, there's no way to summarize it. Or it's not written here, but a third way is that you may want to quote like a definition. And a fourth way would be, certainly you might want to quote where there's a famous phrase, a famous statement. You're referring back to it somewhat cryptically. For instance, one that is often stated talking about understanding children is William James had a famous quote in which he referred to infants as squirming bits of flesh. Well, that's a famous statement. It's in every child psychology textbook. So if your conversation has to do with that, again, you may say, as William James said, and it's a direct quote because it's simply a famous quote. Or, for instance, not in psychology, but let's say you were writing a history paper and you were referring to Winston Churchill's famous quote in World War II when he was encouraging the British nation, "All we have to fear is fear itself." Well, in those particular cases, the quote transcends, if you will, anything, but use them sparingly, and when you do, again, make sure you do them exactly accurately. Thank you for listening, and good luck and effort with your rough draft. I look forward to reading these. Bye-bye.